It's no secret that more and more churches nowadays are moving away from using real amps for their Sunday morning services. Or if they do, it's pretty rare that you'll find amps on stage, and most of the time they are tucked away in another room off stage, and this creates a problem. Standard 1/4-inch cables were not designed to send your signal length so far. So you need some way to safely send your signal all the way to your amp while preserving all of that tone that you're working so hard to get. And that's where these guys come in. The TX-RX-M by Pinstripe Pedals. I'm really excited to talk about these today because I love amps, and any chance that I get to play through a real amp, I jump at the opportunity. And so for years, I have used SGIs and other kind of standard solutions to send my guitar signal to my amp off stage, but I always felt like I was losing some of my tone. It just never quite sounded the same as it did at home when I was practicing. And that frustration is kind of the main reason I moved over to the Strymon Iridium and some of the other modeling solutions out there. But these are just a whole nother breed. They have some really cool features to them that really set them apart from the other solutions on the market right now. Now, if you're not familiar with how a solution like this works, like I said a second ago, 1/4-inch cables were not meant to safely send your signal really far distances. So that's where some of these traditional solutions like the SGIs and things like that have come into play. Basically, how they work is you have a send box like this right next to your pedal board, and you go 1/4-inch out of your board into this, and it will convert your 1/4-inch signal into an XLR signal. And so that way you can run an XLR cable way further distances without it introducing any sort of weird noise or feedback or anything like that. And so you can send that XLR cable way off stage, wherever your amp is, to a receive box, which is another one of these. And then from here, you can convert it back into a 1/4-inch cable and plug that right into your amp. And by the way, I am going to shoot out the TX-RX against the SGI later in this video, so be sure to stick around to see that. Interesting. Now, I really want to start off by talking about the send box. I love what the Pinstripe Pedals team has done with the shape and the size of this. It's pretty much the same size as just a regular guitar pedal, and it's nice and flat on both sides. So it's really easy to just attach this to the top of your pedal board or even the bottom of your board. And the input and output jacks and everything are just really well placed. So it's super easy to just integrate this with your current pedals on your pedal board. It also just takes regular 9-volt power, which is really nice because some of the other solutions out there just have weird power requirements, and it can be kind of a pain because then you need to get the native power supply that came with the unit, and it just gets kind of clunky. So it's great that you can just use your regular power supply to power this as well. You'll see too that it actually has a buffered 1/4-inch output as well, which is pretty cool. So let's say that this just lives on your pedal board, and maybe when you're practicing at home, you actually do have an amp in the room with you. So you can just bypass the XLR output on this and go 1/4-inch out of the buffered output straight into your amps when you don't need to send your signal super far. This also would work too if maybe you use something like a Strymon Iridium or another amp modeler out there when you're practicing at home. And again, you can just bypass that XLR out. But then when you get to church and you do want to use real amps and send your signal to that ISO room or that cabinet off stage, this guy is already attached to your board, and it's as easy as just going XLR out and you're good to go. Also, a little fun fact about this buffered output is that the Pinstripe Pedals multi-buffer actually came from the buffer in here. The beta testers that were testing this out actually said that it was such a good buffer that it deserved its own enclosure. And so that's exactly what Charlie did. Now, everything we've talked through so far is pretty cool, but what really sets this apart from other solutions out there is that it has Jensen transformers both in the send box and the receive box. So if you're familiar with the Daiso Plus, I feel like that's kind of what made the Jensen transformers famous, but basically they are just really, really great at any sort of noise rejection and just ensuring that you're going to get the cleanest and strongest signal possible. So these guys are basically like your traditional SGI type of solution, but with the Daiso Plus benefits on top. And speaking of the receive box, these can throw your signal up to 300 feet, which is really great. So you get plenty of distance to ensure that you're going to have the strongest, cleanest signal and also make it to your amp wherever it is off stage. So like I mentioned earlier, when you are sending that XLR cable off stage, it's basically going to connect to this receive box. And from here, it is going to convert your signal back to 1/4 inch and just send that directly into your amp and you're good to go. Now, maybe you have 2 amps. I think 2 amps are always more fun than just one. If that is the scenario that you find yourself in, it's not a problem. Something that's really cool about these is that you also have the option to daisy chain another receive box. So you can also send your signal into a second amp. What's also really nice though about this receive box is that it does have a ground lift. So if there's any hum or ground noise, you can flip that to get rid of that. And it also does have a polarity reverse switch. So in case you are running into another amp, or maybe you just run into some phasing issues, you can also take care of that from here as well. I do want to mention too, though, on the topic of 2 amps, what we're talking about today is the TX-RX-M. So this is the mono solution. There is a TX-RX-S, which is going to be the stereo solution. So maybe you have a stereo pedal board and you are running stereo effects into 2 different amps. You can also take a look at the stereo version of this as well. Now let's see this in action. Right now I have my pedal board rigged up to be in mono, and I am sending my signal to an amp off stage back in an isolated room. Now, like I mentioned before, we do actually have an SGI lying around here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna test out the TX-RX first, and then we will get everything hooked up with the SGIs and do a nice little A/B test to see if we can hear anything different between the two. That's really interesting. So this was a super interesting experiment. We shot this earlier today, and it was really interesting to just take account of how things felt while I was playing and then listen to the differences when I got home later this evening. And I gotta say, the difference while I was playing was really surprising. It felt to me like the TX-RX had a little more high end, but it just felt a lot more alive in my hands. I actually found myself picking a little bit less hard because it just felt like my signal was coming through a lot stronger. As soon as we plugged in the SGIs and I hit that first chord, it just sounded a little bit more dull, and I found myself playing a lot harder to try to compensate. And listening back to these now, it's interesting because there's not as massive of a difference as what I felt while I was playing them in the moment, but you can kind of tell that it feels like with the SGIs, there's just a little bit of high end and a little bit of like the life of the tone is just kind of sucked out of it just a little bit. Now, I mentioned earlier that the buffer in the send box was actually so good that they went ahead and just put it in their own pedal. And I actually do a deep dive right up here, going through that buffer and kind of unpacking some of the really cool features that they added to it. So feel free to go check that out over here, and I will see you in the next one.